Good afternoon and welcome to VIA Voices. I'm John Fanistil, Executive Director at VIA International on behalf of the entire VIA International team. We welcome you to this weekly conversation. Voices from the VIA International Network, VIA International promoting sustainable community development in under-resourced communities across borders. We're glad to have you with us. Today we're going to be learning a little bit about the history of VIA International and the specific model of community development that VIA International employs and pursues in under-resourced communities in Mexico, Central America, and beyond. Just briefly, though, I want to acknowledge that this is a continuation of a series across the last year, the year of 2020. We were hearing voices from within our network and also looking at issues and news that was breaking from along and across the US-Mexico border. But for this month of January 2021, and then moving forward in the coming months, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the work that VIA International has done across 45 and more years. So what we're going to be doing over these next 3 weeks is looking at the 3 areas of VIA's emphasis one at a time. Today, we'll be focusing on VIA's work in community development. Next week, we'll be looking at VIA's work in global education. And the following, we'll be looking at VIA's work in the US-Mexico, specifically the California, Baja California borderlands. So community development, global education, and borderlands are the 3 areas of emphasis in which VIA has done its work across many years. And we thank you for your interest. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm going to begin by introducing some of the core team of VIA. I'll begin with Elisa Sabatini, our President and CEO, and I'll then introduce Rigo Reyes, our Senior Program Director, and also James Gerber, who's our newest board member at VIA. And the 4 of us will be talking about this work of VIA in the realm of community development. But I'd first like to just give each of them a chance to introduce themselves. And I thought I'd ask, just in the wake of all of the chaos that is swirling around, I just thought I'd ask them to introduce themselves by sharing what's top of mind for you in these days of so much turmoil. And I'll begin with Elisa Sabatini. Elisa, how are you? And what's top of mind for you? And what's in your mind and spirit these days?
Well, good afternoon. Buenos dias. I have been thinking a lot about a meeting that we had last week with the women that are supporting us in the microcredit program, women of living near and the community of Rosarito. And in that conversation, there was a comment that I'm sticking to, which is we need to be of strong heart and flexible. And I think that I'm sort of thinking little strong and pure heart, and the flexibility goes along with all this uncertainty. So that's my mantra for the new year.
Thank you for that. That resonates with me very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. And how about you, Rigo Reyes, Senior Program Director at VIA International? What's top of mind and spirit for you these days, Rigo?
Well, John, well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity and invitation of participating on this charla. For me, and maybe for lack of a better term, what brings to mind is myself being a product of the civil rights movement, particularly growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, and having had that influence in my life. I see this almost like a full circle. What's happening right now, not necessarily that is the same, but very similar to the issues that we were confronting 50-something years ago. And ironically, in my particular experience, some of the issues are the same issues, are exactly the same issues, whether it be police brutality, whether it be immigration, whether it be whatever the topics that people are yelling and complaining about right now, and particularly the temperature in the country. It's kind of like full circle. You know, it's the whole area of activism at its plight. I reflect a lot of what was happening as I was growing up in the late 60s, what was happening in the country at that particular time. the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who, by the way, visited my community the day before he was assassinated.
Hmm.
So all those things come to mind. All those do come to mind, and hopefully I would hope that we had surpassed that particular era, but yet we're still here in the center of it.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Rigo. And let me introduce, I'll just say a word of introduction because some of you may not know our newest board member, Jim Gerber. Jim's a retired professor of economics and Latin American studies from San Diego State. Jim, it's so great to have you part of the VIA board and the VIA team. What's top of mind for you these days in the midst of all the turmoil?
Thank you, John, and hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a little bit intimidated by this scene since I am so new to VIA. I've been corresponding with a colleague of mine in La Paz, Mexico, who is a real fronterizo. He grew up in Calexico, but he's lived most of his adult life in La Paz, and is a professor there at the university, who asked me a question. I just, it's been knocking around in my mind, and I can't really answer it, and it's really come to the fore, which is, how did so many people in the US become so radicalized? What drove this? And I think this probably a question with multiple answers. There's not just one thing, but it seems strange to me. The only thing I can think of is when I was 17, I think, or 16, I read Che Guevara's Reminiscence of the Cuban Revolutionary War, and this was a call to arms. I mean, it was, I was swept up in the romanticism of all that, and it kind of looks like that for some people that I look at, but they're not 17, they're 45 or 50, and so it's, I don't know, is this temporary? Is this permanent? Is this now just the way it's going to be? Is it a small faction of American society, or what? I'm thinking about that a lot and wondering where it goes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. That anxiety and uncertainty just seems so much a part of the air we're breathing, doesn't it? And concern, worry. I feel that very profoundly. I know almost everybody I've been talking to feels that same way. So, well, thanks so much for that. Just again, to acknowledge this bizarre and peculiar environment in which we're living, and also the deep historic roots of it. Rigo, I like your conjuring that this is not entirely new to our history by any means, this degree of civil strife and white resentment and white racism and all the rest, right? This is not a new feature in American history. I've been trying to remain grounded. Some days I do better at that than others, but so remaining grounded and rooted is a kind of I like the mantra that you conjured, Elisa. I'm trying to keep my feet on the ground, if you know what I mean. And that's it's good to do this kind of conversation where we're reminded about the deep and abiding work that makes for long-lasting social change, that the roots of social justice, the grassroots work. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. And I hope these Tuesday conversations will be a welcome conversation for you, as I know they are for me. I always look forward to these charlas. So thank you very much. And today we're going to dig right in and talk about VIA's work in community development. And I thought we'd begin with you, Rigo. You mentioned going full circle, or feeling that you're coming full circle in your introduction. Tell us a little bit about how you found your way from the Chicano civil rights movement to what was then, I guess, Los Niños de Baja California. How did that, and where did the work of Los Niños de Baja California take off? What was its, what are its roots and origins?
Well, first of all, John, maybe give somewhat of a historical perspective, and maybe to some extent a biography perspective as far as my roots, as far as where I was coming from and how this developed. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a product of the civil rights movement, and specifically the Chicano movement. And therefore, when one of my first experiences was basically during the takeover of Chicano Park back in 1970. And having lived through that situation, or through that historical aspect of it, and being so much integrated into the activism that was happening at that particular time, when I came of age, I started becoming involved with perhaps some of the more radical, if you will, spaces within the Chicano movement. I joined the Brown Berets. I was part of many grassroots organizations, which to a great extent gave me sort of like a solid foundation as far as community organizing was concerned. As I grew a little bit older or whatever, I started getting involved, and not only was I being an activist, but my line of work was dealing with development, with community development, specifically working with at-risk youth at that particular time. And by at-risk youth is the term that is widely used, and I think they have other terms for it now. But how we knew it in the community was kind of quote unquote within the gang element, if you will. And that's a whole different subject matter that it doesn't pertain to right now, but it was kind of like my origins as far as community organizing. I was working for a program which was actually a branch of the Child Abuse and Protective Services of San Diego, when I was the only bilingual. I was the only bilingual staff at that particular time. And Los Niños was actually one of our contacts as far as supporting and helping some of the families that we're working with. I had, because I was the only Spanish speaker, I had most of the cases that people that were here illegally, and therefore they have very little access to resources. And Los Niños at that particular time, which were at that time were based out of Brownsville here in San Isidro, was one of our contacts, was one of the contacts that one of the referral contacts that I had as far as trying to get a little bit of resources to try to help these underprivileged families, if you will. So through that process, I became friends with some of the volunteers at that particular time of Los Niños. And prior to that, I had never heard of Los Niños. I had no idea or clue who they were or what they were. And within time, I started learning that they were working across the border, particularly assisting low-income extent, similar to the Peace Corps, if you will. Whereas volunteers will come and dedicate a year or 2 years out of their life, and basically Los Niños will provide basically their board, their food and board, and transportation, and for some of the volunteers to go work across the border. One of the things of the highlights that I noticed at that particular time is that a lot of them were pretty spiritual driven, if you will. They were here for spiritual reasons. And at that particular time when I started working, this was back in the early 80s, 83, I believe it was 83, 84, when I started making that connection. And out of the blues, one of the volunteers approached me and says, you know what, your organization is going through some changes internally. We know that a lot of the work that we're doing in this communities, particularly in Tijuana, to some extent is somewhat devastating in a sense, because although we want to help people, sometimes we feel that we're harming people. We're harming them in a sense because we take food, we take clothing and so on and so forth to these marginal areas. And to some extent, we feel that some of these people are becoming dependent on that. And incidentally, at that particular time, Los Niños wasn't the only one that was doing that. There was a variation of different groups and churches that, to some extent, maybe not as much today, but at one time, there was parades of people of different churches, groups that were going across the border, or perhaps with good intentions, but without really knowing the causes or the consequences, and sometimes the divisions that were created in those communities. Needless to say, I was invited to come and participate. They asked me if I would be interested in working with them. And honestly, for me, it was somewhat of a challenge. Although I am Mexican, I can't deny that. But my reality is I'm a pocho. I was raised in this side. I was raised in the U.S. side of the border, and therefore, although I still have family across the border or whatever, within the identity of who I am as a person, and I identify myself as a Chicano Mexicano, not only are we strangers here in the United States, we still see them as outsiders, even though some of us has been here for many generations, even before this was the United States, but yet we're still seen as outsiders. And the irony here is that we go to Mexico, and Mexico, we're also outsiders. So facing that dilemma, if I'm not here, if I'm not from here, if I'm not from over there, where the heck am I from? That is pretty much integrated into who we are as a people. And that's the feeling that I had at that particular time. So for me, it was kind of like a challenge, if you will. A challenge in a sense of going back to my roots, going back to to my people and where my parents came from, and really grasping into that, kind of like grasping that identity of Mexicanismo. And the Mexicanismo is very important in a sense, but at the same time, the whole challenge of somebody from this side of the border, a quote unquote pocho, going across the border into Mexico and telling them how to do things, or at least trying to come across as far as explaining within the context of the experience that was bringing to the table. At that particular time in 1984, Los Niños was going through a transition of trying to change its methodology, trying to change its philosophy as an organization from an asistencialismo, excuse me, I'm forgetting my Spanish, asistencialismo approach, meaning a direct aid approach, and some people know it as a Band-Aid approach, versus a community development approach. There's a big difference there's a big gap in between that, in the sense that the whole aspect of direct aid, to a great extent, creating dependency, to a great extent, creating sometimes even divisions within the communities. Why? Because when you go into the community, a given community in the outskirts of Tijuana, people within the community start fighting each other because they feel, well, I'm more needy than you are. My family is more needy than you are. And therefore, all these Americanos from across the border come with good intentions, perhaps, but sometimes only there for an hour, 2 hours, and they go back to their middle class America, wherever they came from, without seeing the divisions and the conflicts and what we call in the barrio, the broncas, that are left behind. Los Niños was pretty much aware of this dilemma, of this dynamic that was happening in these particular communities, and they felt that that particular approach had been more damaging than helpful. So when I came aboard, actually, when I got the invitation, was under that umbrella or under that idea of helping the organization change the methodology, change the philosophy from a direct aid to a community development approach. And my background had been primarily with community organizing and initiatives of self-sufficiency and self-reliant approaches of working with community. So I think to some extent it came hand in hand. In 1985, the organization did sort of like an internal evaluation as far as the work that had been done, at least to that point. It had been 10 years since Los Niños had initiated into that particular point of changing or at least trying to change the philosophy of the organization. I was part of that team that was I guess you could call hired to do this internal evaluation. And out of that evaluation came pretty much the different approaches of working with community. One particular aspect was that although at that particular time, Los Niños had developed sort of like a very solid foundation, a solid reputation as far as the volunteerism that were coming to the border. At that particular point, they shifted somewhat, more so from the spiritual aspect of it to a more professional and a more solid foundation as far as the work that was being done at the community. For a number of years, Los Niños still work within the volunteer aspects of approach of working with community, volunteers from the US, but the quality of the volunteer had totally shifted. Now I was getting, and I tell you, I was getting because I was directly involved. I was directly responsible for supervising these volunteers. And at one point I was getting volunteers from some of the top-notch universities in the country. I mean, you name it. I mean, I had people from Colgate, people from Brown University, people from Stanford, people from Princeton. I mean, these kids were top-notch. And a lot of these kids already had Spanish, they had already been overseas. So the quality or the polish of it was of high quality, if you will.
I'm interested to know, Rigo, what do you think was happening in the universities in that period? Were they coming out of particular programs or academic departments or campus ministries, or what do you think was happening in universities at that time that drew them to this kind of new model?
A lot of the students that were coming were coming from the different universities, from international studies. Some that were interested in becoming teachers, some even medics. But again, the level of folks that I was getting was pretty high. I was pretty impressed with some, and for me it was a challenge, because I mean, each season I would get maybe 40 to 50 applicants, and from those I was to choose 4 or 5 of them. So yeah, it was kind of like it was challenging just to get to the decision aspect of it. But these particular folks came and also were very instrumental as far as the development of the organization, because it was thanks to them that not only were we able to develop programs within the community, but also the whole aspect of them coming across to me and saying, you know what, this experience is very solid for me. It's giving me great experience. But the reality is that I'm taking this experience with me to wherever I move on. And very little is staying at the community level. And that was kind of like awakening. I mean, we knew that, but at the same time, the focus was so much on developing these university students or whatever, that the community aspect was also very important, but the focus was more training these folks. So it was actually the whole thought of shifting that around. Whereas, yes, the quality of people is very important, but why can't we develop people from within the community? So to a great extent, that's where the whole aspect or the whole idea of the promotoria or the promotora concept came into be. To a great extent, these volunteers were promotores and promotoras, but with the fact that they were moving on. They were only here for a year, maybe 2 if we were lucky, but they would take that experience with them. So it was kind of like, okay, let's start training people from within. That way, mañana, tomorrow, if we're here as an organization, whether we're here or not, those people from the community are going to continue working whether we're here or not. And I think that's the essence. I think that's the essence of a lot of the work that we do. And again, I take it in the sense that the challenge of working from within the community. At the end of the day, and this is something that I tell all my visiting students and everybody, who knows better the reality of those communities than the people that are living in it? For me, you might call me an expert, you might call me whatever, but at the end of the day, I don't live in those communities. The people that live in those communities are the people that are invested. They're the ones that know day in and day out what really goes on at those communities. So if we could train and we could support their development, the experience stays within the community. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
That was a great answer, Rigo. And I learned a lot just listening to you talk about it. I'd like to pass a question to Elisa, which is, Elisa, you worked in development projects quite a bit before you came to Los Niños. So what were you doing, and how did you get involved in that kind of work when you were doing it?
Yep. Lisa, your microphone. Yeah.
I actually knew of and collaborated with Los Niños all the way back in 1984, 84, 85. I worked for an organization called World Share. And I had actually ended up there because I arrived in San Diego as we had been transferred, my husband and I had been transferred here from Hawaii. And he was at the Naval Hospital here, and I was looking for work. And I had 2 job offers. One was with a maquiladora, with a factory, border factory, to support their personnel acquisition. Would have been sort of like a human resources person. And, it was a decent salary. And the other job was with Share. And they were going to pay me $500 a month. to work with communities. And I thought, I'm going to do that. I sort of think it was insane. But I started working with Share, and what compelled me by it, what compels me by Los Niños and Via, is the concept of self-reliance. Because the idea of that program was self-help and resource exchange, was all about people being their own best resource. And the program was a social business. It basically sold food packages, and it ended up being a national initiative. At one point, we were selling 500,000 food packages a month across the country. And people paid, but the food was highly, the cost structure was highly decentralized, because the packing and it's kind of like you're cutting out the grocery store. And that markup is pretty extraordinary. It has to be so we did this monthly food distribution, and I, for whatever reason, ended up in charge of the program in Mexico. And that program grew over the course of the next 10 years. And we ended up in 17 states in Mexico and in 700 communities in Guatemala. So I was in charge of that. I was the international director for the organization. And I traveled all over and did that kind of work. But way back in those beginnings, the food that we had, the extra surplus sort of food at the end of the distribution, every month we took to Mexico. And one of the organizations that picked up food was Los Niños. So I'd actually worked with them for a long, long time. And I had kind of watched the development of these programs, the nutrition programs, the gardening programs, and the development of those capacities. And had, kind of kept an eye on the organization. But when the former director was departing, he asked me if I knew anyone who would be interested, and I said no. And then he asked again a few months later, and then the board asked me for about 4 or 5 months, and then finally they said, no, we're talking about you. Would you be interested? So I didn't really get that they were talking about me. But and then I came down, and the very first thing I was really interested in doing, and the board thought wise as well, was to meet the staff. And of course, I kind of knew Rigo, or knew of Rigo, but he took me down to the offices in Tijuana, and they were the same offices where we distributed food 14 years before. So, I mean, I've sort of felt like also full circle. Well, here I am back at in somewhat the place I started doing this work. So, yeah, and I had acquired in those 14 years quite a bit of experience with microfinance. That was one of the things, one of the programs that we had grown pretty extensively at World Share. The program we founded in 1989 is now the largest microfinance bank in Latin America, Compartamos. And I think the portfolio of Share in Guatemala is now somewhere around 40 million. I mean, they're large as well, and doing good work, in the highlands of Guatemala. So that was my experience base. And, I came to Los Niños and learned a lot from Rigo and from the women in the communities about grassroots development of leaders. And a number of those women are still with us, that started, with Rigo back in the early 90s. And right now, the microfinance program is expanding kind of down into Rosarito with our partners there, Mujeres para Mujeres, a women's group, mostly North Americans that live down there. And yeah, I think the woman that will be piloting that down there is a woman that's been with Los Niños since 1991.
Yeah. Elisa, you talked about. I'm going to want to get to this leadership development and connect back to Rigo's comment about promotorismo. But first, just give a nutshell definition of microfinance. What's microfinance for somebody who isn't familiar with that concept?
I like to start with banking because most of us do have a bank account somewhere, and we have access at some level, depending on our credit scores, et cetera, for loans and access to capital. Well, most women in particular, but even just most people in low-income communities have no access to capital to grow a business. And so microfinance is essentially the offering of access to often very micro businesses. Now they're even using a lot of the methodologies for medium-sized businesses, but for, and there are many different systems of it, but for people to have access to capital that they normally wouldn't qualify for. And our particular model is a solidarity model where we do group loans, and the groups themselves have to kind of give the backing to the loan for the entire group. So if we were a loan group right here and John didn't pay, we'd have to pay his payment.
Just for example.
Just for example.
And Elisa, could you say a word about how big are these loans typically? I mean, what are they ranged between, and what do people use them for?
Yeah, I mean, generally the loans, well, we start with loans not to the whole group, but to each individual of 2,500 pesos. That right now is what?
$120.
$50 or something like that. They can have an increased loan if they complete that loan cycle and pay it off with interest. And so we go up to about $1,000 loans in any given cycle to an individual. And then what they use them for, a whole array of things. I mean, it might be a woman who's known for her wonderful tamales, and so she needs a big tamale pot. She gets a loan. She can make, more tamales and sell more tamales. And, from the proceeds, she kind of can grow her business. We also have full-on small businesses. We have a group in Tijuana that makes sort of what I call street snacks. I mean, they sell packaged nuts and chips and such, and sort of with street vendors and now in shops, but they actually have 3 employees now. So they've really grown that business. In fact, they've probably outgrown our program because they likely need some larger, scale equipment that would require more credit, more capital.
Well, I want to come back, make sure we come back full circle to the microcredit dimension of the programming, but let me try to connect the two, or ask you all to connect the two. So Elisa, you came with this background in nutrition, gardening, food, and microfinance, and Rigo, you had charted the development of Los Niños, the transformation of Los Niños, with an emphasis on developing the leadership within the communities, and you used that phrase of promotoras or promotorismo. What is a promotora? And because I see and I know that this was a marriage of two, streams of work. What is promotorismo, Rigo? Who is a promotora? And then how did those promotoras embrace some of these new learnings and new models or new methods of developing themselves in their communities?
I think it's important to acknowledge that within any given community, I don't care what community it is, any given community, there's always people from the community that are organizing, that are doing something that rarely do they get the credit for. Whether it be the person at the PTA, the president of the PTA, whether it be the lady that is teaching catechism at the local church, whether it be the lady that Jefe de Manzana, in other words, here in Tijuana, most of the communities are organized by how do you say Manzana? I know it's Apple, but I mean,
Block.
yeah, by blocks in order to bring services to the community. But very rarely are they recognized as such. What we did at that particular time when we were looking for the approach of working directly with community and trying to bring the people from the community from within to take initiative, to take leadership within the communities, those are the people that we started identifying. At that particular time, we started researching the different models that existed, and the promoción social aspect or methodology was very popular throughout Latin America. Not only throughout Latin America, but also some places in Africa also were using that particular model. Traditionally, it had been used in the more rural areas. So when we started adopting that particular model as far as promotoria, promotoras are regarded as outreach workers, for lack of a better term. And that particular model, again, had been more popular more in the rural areas. Why? Because in the rural areas, people know each other from generations. They know the grandmother, and then they used to know the great-grandmother, and so on and so forth. These are people that have lived there through generations. Adapting that model, first of all, to an urban setting. And not only an urban setting, but in our particular case, a border setting, was somewhat of a challenge in a sense, because it was something that had never been seen here at the border. Once we developed and once we started polishing it and started developing people from within, the model took off. So not only were we using it, other nonprofits started to use it. And now today, that particular model is being used in the United States also. Not as much as how we anticipated, in a sense, because for us, it's the term is actually promoción social, social promotion, which whatever the technique, whatever the organizing component is, could be used for whatever needs the community defines. Whereas here in this side of the border, the model has been primarily adopted by health clinics, some hospitals, even some research universities, but very, very specific to a very specific subject matter. Most of the time it's health, whether it be diabetes studies, whether it be whatever. Whereas the model on the other side, throughout Latin America, the community is the one that decides what the issues are. And again, I state the fact that who better to know the reality of those communities than the people that live it. And a lot of the models that are used here in the United States are kind of like in a box, if you will. Whereas they'll support you or they'll sponsor your project in a very specific box, but don't get out of the box because you get defunded. Whereas in Latin America, that's not the issue. Again, giving the people the tools, the proper tools that they need to organize in their communities, it's the drive. That's the drive behind this particular model. I hope I explained. I'm not sure if I explained that particular model. Again, it's two different models in a sense, because in Latin America, it works one way. Here in the United States, it's kind of limited.
So in my experience, Rigo, mentioning that in the North American side, I was familiar with, again, you mentioned this, often a health model or a research model where the parameters of the program are developed maybe for a research investigation or a health, particular, you'd mentioned diabetes. And then these promotores become almost like contracted workers to a
Correct.
university, or they have a contract and a term, and they conduct a certain line of investigation or of promotion that's defined by the researcher or the agency that hired them, right?
Correct.
Uh,
Versus in Mexico, for example, our example with the whole component of the Educación y Promoción program, which is sort of like a project that we helped develop as far as training promotoras from within the city. Some of these graduates from these certification programs, they went on to develop their own NGOs. Again, because they know better than we do.
So Rigo,
They develop their own projects, to develop their own programs, to develop their own, again, without the umbrella or without the control, if you will, of an agency.
Rigo, would it be correct to say that the promotora model then in Latin America is more similar to what in the US we might call community development or community organizer?
I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so, definitely.
I think too that an important aspect of this is to talk about the qualities. When I joined the organization, the thing that
Yes.
really caught my attention was the nature of these women that are the promotoras. First of all, they're honest. You can trust them. They're nonviolent. They just keep doing the work. They're constant in the communities. And I mention this because I noticed there was a question there about, well, what do you do in a moment like the moment we're in? And if you're really listening to the communities, what are the communities saying? Well, they're saying we need food. And they're saying we need some of this, you could say more of a charity approach right now. Well, I'll tell you who raised their hands. Those promotoras distributed food in their communities. Yeah, we organized to raise some money, but they organized to get it distributed out to many hundreds of families in Tijuana because they know the people. They know who needs it. They know the networks. They know the communication structure. They're the leaders. And furthermore, in our microfinance, because so many of our little businesses were they were just shut down, we also, a service that we could offer was to raise some money so that they could provide their catering services, some of their holiday services over the holidays. We had several of these microfinance business people provide their services in children's homes. So we distributed food in the shelters from May until September, but we could only do that because we had the leadership of those little businesses in the community to do so. So it's almost like we rely more on them. In some ways, they are the leaders of us. I mean, we listen to what the community says and in some ways try to bridge and discover resources and to support what they're talking about. And I think that's the real distinction of the work that we've done, over these years. I also,
Yeah.
I also was just going to say, I think some of the newer work that we're doing is another sort of full circle aspect of going back to, I mean, who are the people that we've helped over all these years? Well, so many of them migrated to Tijuana, primarily from other parts of Mexico, not only, but primarily. And, in recent times, we've had a real issue with this new thrust of migration coming into the region. And to that end, we've launched a program building on kind of our strategies and the supports of our programming over the years, called Via Migrante, which is intended to help migrants and deportees in the communities of Tijuana.
And Rigo had mentioned the unique qualities or characteristics of the borderlands, that represented a challenge, and it was a new context for the models of promotoria and community development, microfinance, et cetera. Rigo, what was it about those communities, the borderlands communities of Tijuana or Mexicali? What was it about those communities that made them different or distinct? What unique challenges did they present?
I think to a great extent, and you hit it right in the nail, as far as Tijuana in itself, and particularly the communities that we work with, which were more in the outskirts of the city, if you will. These are communities that are barely starting off, and therefore they lack many of the basic services. And sometimes that's what brings them together, in a sense, trying to bring those type of services into the community. I think one of the most important elements of it is basically developing community, if you will, because they're new communities and because they come from different parts of the country, from the República. Some come from the Baja, some come from Mexico City, some comes from Oaxaca, from Jalisco, from Michoacan, regardless of where they come, and they come with their own customs. They come with their own ways of doing things. And they meet each other here at the border, And therefore, when it comes to, somebody mentioned tamales earlier, they come with a style of making tamales from Sinaloa, and somebody from Jalisco says, wait a minute, mine are better because this is the way we do them. So in essence, you're developing community within the city of Tijuana. And the projects that we develop over the years that will be the nutrition and the ecology programs, will be the microloan programs, brings people together. And I think the important element that I don't think has been mentioned here is the whole aspect of trust. You're developing that trust. If people don't know each other, they're not going to trust each other. So people, for when they do these particular communities, once they get to know each other, they start finding out they probably have more in common than they have difference.
So, and when I arrived a year ago, we were talking about this. You know, I arrived and there had been this, you know, much tumult in the news about all these new migrants arriving in Tijuana. And of course, I knew a little bit, but as I, you know, worked with you all, you kept emphasizing, well, this has always been Tijuana's history. Tijuana is a city of migrants. It's always been people relocating, and many of the communities that Via or even Los Niños originally worked in were communities established by migrants who had moved from south to north and had ended up, you know, building the colonias of Tijuana. So that, and then out of these conversations emerged, as Elisa is saying, our vision for this program of Via Migrante. And before we close, I do want to just introduce our friends in the Zoom room and watching on Facebook, introduce them to Aida Amador, who's a member of our staff, who is working now with Rigo and Elisa, specifically, and along with others, Robert Vivar, Dan Watman, friends to many of us. But Aida is helping to kind of build out this program with collaborating with Elisa, Rigo, and our partners in Mexico of the Via Migrante program, trying to take the methods and models that have proven so successful in community development across so many years and piloting them to learn if they can also be fruitful and helpful for more recent arrivals in Mexico, which include a different mix of characters, a different mix of migrants, if you will. Aida, tell us a little bit about where Via Migrante is right now, what's happening with the piloting of the Via Migrante program.
Hi, everybody. Well, we started almost 1 year ago trying to do the programs that we do at Los Niños and Via with the migrant and deportee communities. And we began with the interaction of the communities because we wanted to gain their trust and we wanted to learn what they needed, because as Rigo said, who better to tell us what they need than the own community. And we started with Casa de Luz, that is a collective and inclusive space for the migrant of the LGTB community and mothers and families, Madres y Familias Deportadas, which is a community center that provides help to families separated with deportation, and the shelter Juventud 2000. But when the pandemic began, we had to find a way to continue to help, but also take care of ourselves, the promotoras, and the community. So we started trying to look at ways to do the nutrition and ecology programs virtually. So that's what we're starting to do actually this month. We're going to start the nutrition and ecology program on Madres y Familias Deportadas, and we're going to do it in Casa de Luz with Fabiola and Griselda, which are two of our promotoras. And we are helping them as well because, for example, Griselda lost her job with the pandemic. We are doing as well workshops in collaboration with the Universidad Iberoamericana of psychological support, law, and we're also trying to obtain a little space for huertos orgánicos, farming, with the Binational Park and with Cultiva Ya. We're having a meeting in 2 weeks to see if we can secure that space because Casa de Luz really, really wants community farm. So we're trying to see if we can provide that. And hopefully after the nutrition and ecology program, we will try hopefully to get a microcredit program with them.
So the program of Nutriecología, Nutrition and Ecology, is a way of assembling leaders from within these three. You've identified the three pilot programs. And tell us briefly, Aida or Rigo, Elisa, just what's a program of Nutriecología look like? What is it? Maybe I should ask what does it taste like?
What that we work with the community. Actually, we do usually have like the menu, the 16 course of menus. But now, because it's a different community, we talk with familias y madres deportadas, and we talk with the migrant community. And we came up with a menu which is exactly what they wanted instead of what we wanted to give them. So the two of them are totally different. For example, on the Madres y Familias Deportadas, we have soy chili beans, we have a lentil hamburger, and then with the Casa de Luz shelter, we have dishes from Central America, and we also have Mexican dishes because we wanted that. We have pizzas because they wanted that. Everything very healthy, and yeah, and especially right now with the pandemic, that we need to have nutritious meals, that we need to have to grow our own food. I think it's something that they will really benefit with.
And so it's out of that yeah, Elisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just like to mention, we've been able to do this kind of series of work, some of it providing the meals there at Juventud Mil from the microcredit, some of the food programming, and this particular programming for Via Migrante with support from the International Community Foundation. So that was, one of the funders that has stepped forward quickly to help in the situation that we find ourselves. As well, the loan funding, which we will have some available, will come from Women's Empowerment International, that has agreed that this particular community of migrants and deportees are very important to establishing their livelihoods in the area, because these are not people that will pursue, or likely will pursue, asylum and try to get into the United States. They will remain residents of and become residents of Tijuana.
So, and then there are many other individual donors and family foundations have been contributing as well to the Via Migrante program. If this year we're piloting in 3 communities, but very much hoping to find what works with these new populations, and whether this method and model can be replicated precisely. Probably not. It probably will require its own adaptation and innovation. But I wanted just to make sure that the folks in the program got to hear it briefly from Aida. And I do want to just maybe close out by encouraging any who have questions to feel free to drop us a line. I mentioned that our friend Robert Vivar has been especially active in helping with the Via Migrante program with the Centro for Familias, Madres y Familias Deportadas, the Deported Mothers and Families Network. And our friend Dan Watman, who many of you know, has been instrumental in the relationship building at the Casa de Luz collective for LGBTQ migrants. And the Shelter Juventud 2000, Via and the Promotoras have been doing food distribution there through the period of the pandemic. And we have prior history with Juventud 2000. Many of us had worked with that shelter previously and visited that shelter. And some of the people from that shelter are participants in our Charla Amigo program for Spanish language learning. So these are all relational networks, but we're looking forward to experimenting in the coming year to find out whether this proven model of community development will work in the context of these new populations. Elisa said something I just want to underline, and I don't know if Robert wants to chip in, but the number of people who come with the intention of seeking asylum versus the number of people who actually ever achieve asylum, those are two very, 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 very different numbers, right? And so our preoccupation with Via International is on people who are become residents of Tijuana and or Mexicali, as the case may be, or are sinking roots into local communities. And as we're evaluating our work and figuring out where we can be most helpful, that I would suggest is something of a niche that VIA has long occupied with excellence. And while of course we want to be of assistance to migrants and asylum seekers, I should say, to asylum, and we'll continue to offer that as need be, there are other organizations that have asylum seeking as their clear and undivided focus. And that's not really the unique expertise nor the clear and undivided focus of VIA. So I like to think there's so much good work, of course, needing to be done, but I just wanted to emphasize that asylum seekers per se, while they are such an important population, they suffer so greatly and are very much in the news. That's not the only turf there is to work in these border cities, northern border cities of Mexico. So yeah, Robert, I don't know, did you want to say anything about your experience working with, I'll bring Robert Vivara into the room, your experience working with asylum seekers, Robert? How does that play out on the ground for people who think they come to the border, going to go to the United States?
Sure, thank you, John. Actually, there's a very unfortunate misconception that a lot of people think that just by coming to apply for asylum, that they've got a good opportunity being granted asylum regardless that they have a very compelling case. The reality is that it's only a fraction of those that apply for asylum that are able to win asylum and be able to remain in the United States. 1, maybe 2%. So you can imagine the amount of people that at the moment are here in the border town, in the border area, that have applied for asylum, that are coming to realize that they're not going to be granted asylum, and their only real option is to remain in Mexico. Therefore, the programs that we're offering here at VIA are something that are going to be very beneficial for them on the road to self-reliance, to self-sustainability, and have a better quality of life for themselves and their family.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And thank you all. Well, I invite everybody in the Zoom room to just join me with a round of applause for especially Rigo and Elisa for sharing that deep history of VIA's work with community development. Next week, we're going to talk about the global education component, which was a more recent add-on, building off of some of you heard mention of it with all of the participating students and volunteers, but that has emerged over many years into its own realm of work, and we'll be exploring that next week, especially talking with Elisa and Rigo about how these two components, community development and global education, complement each other. But I am going to sign off from Facebook. Just want to encourage folks on Facebook, if you'd like to join us in the Zoom room, please just drop us a line. We'll send you the information. And to those of you who are in the Zoom room, we'll stick around for a few more minutes afterwards. And if there are any questions that you'd like to lift up at that time, we'll do that. But for now, thanks very much for joining us. VIA Voices, Tuesdays at 12 noon. And drop us a line anytime at viainternational.org or at the VIA Cafe, viacafe.org, where we're online and ready to introduce you and connect you across borders. So thanks so much for joining us on Facebook, everybody, and bye-bye from there.